So good afternoon. I hope that you all have enjoyed the outside for the lunch break. My name is Oliver Lutz. I'm a lecturer here at ACT. I'm just here to bring in the next panel and the moderator. But just before that, a couple announcements. So this next panel will be going for a couple of hours, and then we will have a coffee break. So I know in the previous panel there's a lot of coming and going during the panel. If we can limit it and sort of hold on a bit and sort of take our leave during the break, we will then reconvene at 5 o'clock for the last panel. And finally, the closing remarks, which will be at 7. Nader Tarani will be sharing his thoughts about this whole weekend and what we've heard. So the moderator for the next panel, Speculations on the Future of Urban Space, Utopia, Alexander Dohoga, is architect and director of the MIT Center for Advanced Urbanism and principal of the Organization for Permanent Modernity. The CAU is a collaborative effort involving faculty across MIT, focused on large-scale design projects that address critical urgencies of the urban age, including climate adaptation urbanism, health and urbanism, technology and urbanism, and urbanism of the global south. ORG is a professional design firm with locations in Boston and Brussels, invested in durable architectures, simple artifacts able to handle complex demands and requirements. Currently ongoing projects include construction sites for 40,000 to 250,000 buildings within ORG master plans. ORG has also developed urban models for suburban environments in the US, for coastal environments in Europe, and for new land-making developments in Asia. Dohoga is associate professor in architecture urbanism with tenure at MIT and has published internationally, notably with The Liberal Monument, Princeton Fall 2010, and with recent papers in relevant journals in Germany, Israel, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, the USA. And he's obtained his PhD at Berlage Institute in 2007 with TU Delft, after achieving a master's in urban design at Harvard GSD in 2001, and a master's in architecture and civil engineering from the University of Leuven in 1996. So, Alexander, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for that very exhaustive introduction. The title of this afternoon's panel is Utopia, Speculations on the Future of Urban Space. We have very, very interesting speakers, 3 of them to this topic. Andres Jaque, Mark Wigely, and Gediminas Urbonas. And Anna Miljacki will be acting as a respondent and is preparing a significant response to these presentations. I will start with introducing these 4 speakers, well, the 3 speakers and the respondent, and then have a very short reflection on the topic before passing it on to each speaker to present their work and reflections on the topic. First, Andres Jaque. Andres directs Andres Jaque Architects, but also the Office for Political Innovation. This office explores the potential for post-foundational politics and symmetrical approaches to the sociology of technology in order to rethink architecture practice. The slogan of the office, I believe, is "Architecture is technology-rendered society," and they're currently devoted to the study of connected domesticities and politically activated urbanism. In 2012, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the MoMA, incorporated their work IKEA Disobedience into its collection as the first architectural performance acquired by the museum. They also are authors for a series of buildings, including the Placentia Clergy House, House in Never Neverland, Tupper Home, and Escaravox. All of these got several awards, and I could spend the next 10 minutes just listing all the awards that this office has garnered. Currently, Andres is an advanced design professor at the Graduate School of Architectural Planning and Preservation, Columbia. He's been the Tessenhoff Stipendiat in 1998 in Hamburg, and a visiting teacher and professor in a series of international universities, including in Zurich, Milan, Paris. His lectures also in Brussels, Buenos Aires, Rotterdam, and Bogota. So we will look forward to your lecture, Andres, but not yet. I first want to also introduce Mark Wigely. I'll do all the introductions first. So Mark Wigely obviously behooves no introduction, and so we can spend a long time about Mark. I'll just list a few of the big highlights. Mark was the Dean of Columbia University's Graduate School of Architectural Planning and Preservation for 10 years. In 2005, he founded Volume magazine together with Rem Koolhaas and Ole Bouwman. He also created, together with Brett Steele, the Institute of Failure, essentially an academic institution for the instruction and theory of failures. He's written extensively on the theory and practice of architecture and is the author of Constance New Babylon, The Hyper-Architecture of Desire in 1998. If ever there was a utopian architect, it must have been Constant. White Walls, Designer Dresses, The Fashioning of Modern Architecture in 1995. He also co-curated with Philip Johnson the MoMA exhibition, Deconstructivist Architecture. The third panelist, Gediminas Urbonas, is one of our own here at MIT. He co-founded with Nomeda Urbonas the Urbonas Studio, an interdisciplinary research practice that advocates for the reclamation of public spaces and wants to stimulate cultural and political imaginations and tools for social change using art. Recent work includes Utopia, which was a commission for the European Capital of Culture in 2012, a research project that worked with experimental media and communication techniques in order to map heterotopias and dysfunctional infrastructures in order to address and respond to the environmental damage left by the industrial and military interventions in the Turku archipelago on the Baltic Sea. Urbonas' work has been exhibited at many biennales worldwide, also in Sao Paulo, Berlin, Moscow, Lyon, and Guangzhou. The Manifesta and Documenta exhibitions, solo shows at the Venice Biennale and MACBA in Barcelona, and has been awarded many, many prizes, of which I want to mention the Lithuanian National Prize and the prize for the Best International Artist at the Guangzhou Biennale in 2006. Also, this is important to point out, Urbonas is the co-founder of the Transaction Archive, and he's also co-director of the Protest Lab Archive. His writing on artistic research as a form of intervention in social and political crisis was published in the books Devices for Action and Villa Lithuania. There is currently a book on river cultures that you are preparing, and I think that's what you will talk about. And this is a preparation by Modern Art Oxford. Okay. Besides these three speakers, Anna Miljacki will follow these three as a respondent. And Anna is an architect, an assistant professor of architecture here at MIT, where she teaches theory and design. She holds a PhD in the history and theory from Harvard and an MArch from Rice. Her interests range in the role of architecture and architects in Cold War era of Eastern Europe, through the theories of postmodernism within late socialism, to politics of contemporary architectural production. She recently curated and produced with her students the Fair Use exhibit at MIT in 2013, also organized a symposium called Under the Influence, mapping out ways in which architects influence each other and ways in which architects borrow from each other. And she's currently completely consumed and engaged with the preparations for the American Pavilion in the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale for 2014, together with Eva Franch Igilabert and Ashley Schaefer of the, this is a co-curatorship. So, this title and the work that these people will present to us will come from very different angles. And if you compare our panel to some of the previous ones today and later ones, I would venture to say that this one will attack or tackle, at least partially, some of the interactions and differences in the practices of art, architecture, and urbanism. And we all want them to be really close to each other, but somehow architecture suffers from a complicity with the powers that be in a way that art will never have. And I think that goes to another degree up in urbanism. The association with large-scale capital and institutional power is a requirement for architecture to have an imprint in society. And this complicity makes its role as an art practice sometimes more difficult. Nevertheless, I do think there is a possibility for more inspired practices in art, in architecture and urbanism at least, to engage the utopian. It's not possible for architecture and urbanism, at least I don't think, to control or to realize an alternative social order, that really utopian, different imagination. It's simply not within the toolbox of these fields, but it is possible to realize, either within a building, as a building, or as a fragment of a city, a composition of buildings and spaces, somehow through the formal organization of this composed fragment, a microcosm of what a diagram of an alternative order might look like. So I do think there's a great empowerment that even in its complicity with power, through formal organization, architects and designers can make an ideogram or a diagram of an alternative order and realize that, pour that into concrete, and let it be inhabited by the status quo. So that creates a huge tension, but that tension can be realized. The effective intervention and the active intervention and politicization of public space, I think that would be much more, that's less easy for conventional architectural practice to achieve. That's really the prerogative of art. And all of these relate to each other because ultimately there is form making engaged, and there are ways in which ideological discussions range between these fields. I'm incredibly curious to learn from the artists that will be in today's panel, and also from the architects, and especially also from the people that bridge both and have, like in Andrés's case, two distinct categories of work that then connect to each other. I'll leave it here. I just want to make one last note, just as a term of vocabulary. Most of you know this, but utopia, the terminology, the word utopia is historically defined in complete opposition to reality. Its embedding into reality is therefore, by definition, not possible. So, however, any speculation that has the utopian gene, that wants to have that level of incredible ambition, only will really achieve its power if it is not just an imagination, but it is a promise of enactment, a promise of actually being able to change something out there. So is this possible? Is it possible to, yes, inhibit the utopian gene and go for it, and not be restricted to the gallery, and actually enact an actual change? And this is the real test for all of us. I thank you for your patience with this introduction, and we'll be very happy to give the first word to Andrés. Let me just say one last thing. It is a real privilege and an honor to be part of a conference that celebrates the work of Antoni Muntadas, and I take great pride in that. Okay. Andrés, now it's really your turn.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm super happy to be part of this symposium in which many things that Antoni Muntadas has been working collectively in so many places are discussed. And I must say that the work that Antoni Muntadas has been doing these years has been incredibly important, for not only for me, but for a network of people with which I'm connected, and that we're working, and that finding in many of your works at many different moments alternatives to the architectural practices that at some point we were taught. So it's really important for me to be here and to be part of this discussion. Okay, I'm going to start. I'm going to be talking about 4 different approaches to something similar. So these approaches actually are kind of not totally coincident. There are things that are different and positions that make things different, but in a way they are constellations of something that is connected. The first is, I would like to start with something that Ute was posing this morning, and is the the question about space. And I'm going to be talking in the 4 cases about projections. So I would like to bring the future, the question about the future, into something that is very common to architecture, that is that architecture produces renderings and produces projections on the future. And both these renderings and those projections are something that has to do not only with fixed realities, but they have an evolution, they are processes. Actually, I would like to talk of this process, the construction of the Ciudad de la Cultura, this big project by Peter Eisenman and architects and partners, and Peter Eisenman architects, and that it was actually something that compromised the budget of the region of Galicia for a long time, and that was very much discussed. Actually, it was at that point in which it was so discussed that we were called, because at the first moment in which they started to finish the Earth movement, the politicians thought that actually it was a very ugly building site and that it was too visible. And we were asked to produce a fence, a wooden fence was suggested, so we could cover the building site so the people in Galicia wouldn't see that ugly transformation of such a precious landscape. This is actually what we proposed. We said that, well, actually it was not ugly at all because the building site was really amazing. It was like an Egyptian construction going on there, but it was not visible because probably no one could understand what was going on there, and there are huge implications that were connecting them to that process. So we proposed to do a series of 12 actions that we call 12 actions to make Peter Eisenman transparent, to make the whole building site something that could be somehow understandable to a certain extent by the people of Galicia or people that were not totally involved within the process of the building site, at least not directly or not in a position of power to that. The actions were very basic things. For instance, the building site was divided so it could be hired to 12 different building companies. So we just provide one color to each of the companies, and we convince the people to put that in the contract. So every person working for a company or every machine or vehicle or fence or wherever would be painted or would be signed with that color. For instance, that's well, those things. And here, for instance, the very piece of the building site that was occupied and was in charge of each of these companies. Or, for instance, basic things like showing what was and signing what was the content and the origin of all the trucks that were coming in or leaving the building site, or informing of the works that were carrying out at each certain moment, or even developing some devices so people could really say what they make visible in a landscape scale what was going on there. Some of these, for a while, well, the proposal was initially accepted, then it was cut to a certain extent, but we got to do many of the things for a certain time before we were fired. Because there was too much noise going on with these kind of actions. Because actually it was making visible things that were not so, well, they were controversial as they had to be, and I think that it would be much better to keep this debate, but some people thought that it was not that good idea. For me, this image is very important. This was a photograph that we took one day that one of the signs fall down because it was super windy, so it started to move a little bit, and one of the nets fall down. So we had to go there to check what was going on. And we found that there was the people in the blue building site or building company, they were fixing the yellow sign. And we asked the architects that were in charge of the process and the engineers, and they couldn't tell us why the blue ones were working in the yellow one. Actually, they said, no, they couldn't do it. The security plan wouldn't allow them to do that. But then we asked some retired people that were going there, and that they became kind of a public that were evaluating the process, and they could explain perfectly what was going on there. They told us that there was an agreement between the blue ones and the yellow ones, so they would use the equipment and the people of the other one when they had a peak of need. Actually, for me, that was kind of an interesting thing, because we keep, at this moment, there was so much debate on what's the role the image of buildings could play in architecture, and it was clear that maybe there were some political roles that could be played by the way that things were painted in colors or were signed, and that it's not something that only produced kind of an image, but the rendering of building site with these codes were also enabling people to have some kind of empowerment in the way they could relate critically to something that this process. For me, it's interesting because then it makes me think that the public, as Ute was saying this morning, it's probably now more than ever kind of a moment that we can make it longer and that we could somehow think that it's public because it's enrolling other people, is critically equipped, is keeping all the controversies open and visible and part of the making of daily life. And this kind of processual way of thinking of the public, for me, it's now quite interesting, and I'm trying to work on that. The second thing I'd like to talk, and it's kind of a different approach to the same thing, is renderings. We're surrounded by renderings. This one I really love, and it's from 1974. It's the photograph that announced the pilot or the first episode, or the first season of this Little House in the Prairie. Did you know the Little House in the Prairie? Yeah, of course, everywhere. It's a global thing. Okay, it was an NBC thing. Well, do you know this one? Yeah, it's from the same year. And actually, they reproduce kind of a similar situation with the house and the family and kind of the feeling of being at home. Actually, for me, this idea of families directly connected to one architectural device, the home, and so clearly also is related to this other image in which we see that they see the city down there. And in a way, they see society down there. For those familiar with this show, it's kind of clear that the grandfather was not so much into being social, and that he was thinking that his house was a little bit away from that, and that was a place from which you see the society and the politics out there, down there. And actually, there's this idea that at home, in the surroundings of the house, you can be in your underwear. You rule, let's say. Okay, this is actually from the same year than the two images before. I mean, not this image, but the opening of IKEA in Tokyo, and with that, it started the whole international expansion of IKEA as a global architectural actor, the most important one probably now, and. It's 1974, the year, and it's interesting to see how IKEA is been reproducing this same idea. The idea that at home you get to an independent republic and that you don't need to wear your high heels or whatever social convention because you're at last you're in your domains. In a way, there's always this confusion between being an independent republic or a kingdom, which is not really that important. Well, this is the project that Alexander was mentioning, IKEA Disobedience. We were collecting cases in which people were not really doing what IKEA was saying. They were not really having their home as independent republics, but they were engaging from the very interiors of the domestic space or devices, or environments. They were engaging on projects that connect them politically with others, with the collectivity, or with some kind of network of political activation. For instance, the case of Candela was very clear, or this one of Manolo, or this one Tony. Well, we could go through all of them. Then it was in New York. We did many other cases. We found many other cases like this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. For instance, Maddie, I love it. She has there's a saloon in her Long Island, what it used to be a TV room, so actually it's super interesting. And it's actually the place that in the neighborhood is the most active socially. People go there just to talk to the others and because it's open to the public, so it's much more active socially and politically than any street in the neighborhood in the suburbs. In many senses. In other senses, of course, the streets are also activated. In this case, that is very important, is Berta, who's a woman, or at that moment was a woman, now, no, now he's a man. And but she was coming from a tiny village in Spain to Madrid, and she ended up living in this squat house, in which is a squat house for women, and only for women that want to gain some kind of gender empowerment. And Berta, through this process of being part of this architecture that is so much constructed materially, kind of gain opportunities to define many things and to change the way her body, her personality, her social dimension could be constructed. Many other cases, then we produce a series of situations in which we try to have an interface in which society could have, other parts of society, other publics could have an interaction with these situations and could have an understanding of what was going on there. So there was an awareness that there's kind of a counter way of thinking of the domestic environments that is not the one that IKEA is massively advertising. Okay, sweet politics is the third one. And I'm going to put this one again because actually I think there's a number of political debates going on here. And there's a number of urban constructions that are struggling or are fighting or are being discussed within something as basic as the her. This is an image that probably all of us have seen many times. Is the L'Oreal Elbibe campaign for dyeing your hair with new colors, and it's actually something that many times we think is a little bit banal, or maybe we don't tend to consider that so important politically, but it's actually part of a huge, massive scale transformation of the market, and it's reacting to the fact that L'Oreal and Elbibe is getting new markets in Africa, in the north of Africa mainly, and in Latin America, and that you can see that is actually the place where they're growing, and they're producing new images of bodies and colors that could excite the target of the markets that they want to succeed, in which they want to succeed. Actually, it's very tricky because most of the people that we see here, even though they could be connected to the image or the cliche image of many of the locations in which they want to succeed, actually are people that are totally part of the Western societies. Actually, this is one of them. And this is Paz Vega. That was the person selected to advertise this new Mediterranean line of shampoos and conditioners and all these things that was actually reacting to this. This is a photograph that Paz Vega published in her Facebook account on May 16, 2011. It's actually a photograph of herself. You can see here in Sol Square in Madrid. And it's very exciting to see that she's having this huge image of herself in the El Corte Inglés department store facade. Okay, this is a photograph that was taken a few days later when all this started. You can see that people are photographing this, and you can see so many photographs in the internet of people taking photographs of the first 15 and what was called the Spanish Revolution demonstrations there. Actually, this is the way it looked that day, and you can see here the position of the advert and this huge device to transform the landscape of from bodies to continental realities. This is a photograph that was taken a few days later, a couple of days later, and it's very interesting for me to see that there's all sorts of reactions to this advert, from people remembering the polemics on the connection between the L'Oreal family and the Nazi regime, but there's something much more interesting for me, which is this banner there that says "La Revolución será," and that is broken. It's amputated, like Mark was saying before. It's amputated, and it's been amputated. So it was a sign that said "La Revolución será feminista o no será." The revolution will be feminist or it won't be. Actually, a few days later, on the 23rd, there was this banner saying exactly this: without feminism, there won't be revolution, equality, reciprocal support. This is very important. Something very complex happened between these 2 days. So this is the 20th, this is the 23rd. In this moment, the banner was amputated. This day, it was replaced by one that was kept till the moment that the revolution, let's say, finished. Okay, what happened in between the two banners? We have to go back to here. And what was the participation? The question is, what was the participation of architecture in between these two banners? It's not that easy as saying something like it was the square. The architecture was providing a square that was available for people. It was kind of neutral, and people arrived there, occupied it, and that was the way architecture took part on this. It was much more complex. This image is very important because it all started with this. This is March 11, so a few months before. A number of people occupied the chapel in the sociology department of the Complutense University, and they showed their teeth. Basically, it was mainly women, but there were also men, and it had a huge controversy. And actually, it had a huge. Of course, they were reacting to many things that had been done before, for instance, by Femen, and they were kind of well. It was a big controversy. They were detained. There were people that were saying that they would going to be fined with huge fines, and eventually, in the same university, in this building, in this hall, there was a commission organized to fundraise for these people to get lawyers and to eventually pay their fines. Actually, one of the meetings happened to be in Seoul. And these people say, oh, wow, this atmosphere is so macho. If there's a revolution, we should be represented here. So they started to put these kind of banners that were the ones that were amputated. Actually, they moved to and they opened a settlement, let's say, a tent, that was the Commission of Feminisms. And if we go on saying what were the architectures that were part of this, we have to say that from different universities, there were teachers that were asked to be there. And actually, there were books that were discussed there. And they opened another place that was the Taller, a workshop of feminism. We couldn't finish this account here because there were a series of other architectural spaces or devices that were taking part in this, like a number of self-organized houses, social houses, that were making the whole thing much more complex, bringing issues like domestic violence and connecting the square to all those different homes of people that had suffered gender violence, and from their homes they were taking part already in this discussion. And a number of other places like La Escalera Caracola, another squad, that was organized. We can see it as something very cheap or whatever, but it's a very sophisticated architecture in the way that is maximizing the possibility of relational capitals, and it's connecting all these networks together. Actually, this is the house, and it belongs to a whole network of houses for women. That is this one here. Squads mainly. And actually, we got to know many of these things because of two of the IKEA disobedience that were very active. One I already told you is Theo, and the other is this one. Actually, Theo was a big thing here because at that moment she was starting to transform her gender into his gender, and it was a big debate that many people said in Seoul that that was not feminism anymore, so she shouldn't be there. And then these people started to be connected. And these are a group of people that were in another university that are called RQTR, and that they brought the transgender issues into Seoul. And we could see that they have all these other spaces, and they even took the occupied, the gay pride. They get the prostitutes here that were distributed in the city, and they also wanted to have this is what it's saying, we horse insist politicians are not our children. What is really interesting is this is the location of the association, this is the website. I mean, we could go on, but the Spanish Revolution was actually just a tiny piece. Like this transformation of two banners was actually participated by a huge amount of super diverse architectural devices. Actually, this one I really love. This we see this lady here. It's super interesting. This old lady is part of this place, which is in Asturias, in the north, in a mines area, in which there are so many widows. And the widows organize this amazing house for women empowerment that is kind of a different kind of feminism, and it's an architectural device that they have even purple lights, so it's super sophisticated in that I really love. And after a few days, you could see so many males wearing this kind of feminism, or it's inclusion, or it's not, or whatever. So actually, what I'm trying to say is if we have to account for the architecture and the participation of architecture in the making of these politics, the square is not enough. We have to find a way of talking of this, which is actually the network of different architectural devices that got mixed with society and embodied this huge political transformation. And I would say that maybe this distinction between, okay, the city is public space and non-public space, as Ute was saying this morning, it's another definition, which is what I would like to call urban enactments, that are things like this. And we've been tracing many of these things, and, oh, I don't know, it's missing, but maybe it's time to finish. So thank you so much.
No, it's a real pleasure to follow Andres, but it's also impossible. So this will be a utopian presentation in that sense. Firstly, it's a great honor to be here for Muntadas' exit interview. But more than anything else, it's a great honor to know you and to know your work. And sometimes you know the work of an artist and you get to know them too. And it's a real, in either case, it's a kind of amazing. And part of why it's amazing is that Muntadas is one of a group of artists that I'm lucky to know that know more about architecture than architects do. And he has all of the advantages of being a human being as distinct from an architect. So he kind of sees our species with a very acute eye. So every time we get together, I learn an enormous amount about myself and my own field, because he will say things like, "I noticed you just did this thing in Barcelona. What was that?" And you find yourself having to in a way defend yourself. Then, of course, you realize after a while that you're not the only person in that situation, that there are many, thousands of people that are in the network of Muntadas. And actually you discover that there are also many times friends you have already. So after a while you discover that somebody that you are friends with is also enjoying very much the relationship with Muntadas. So it's very much a network which confuses the line between architecture and art and so on, but it's also a kind of a research network. And it's I don't know exactly how it works, but there's a strong relationship between that network and the work itself, if we can say that, which is much more rigorous, I would say, in an academic sense than most academic projects. I mean, the research into the sort of multidimensional analysis of the art world from every point of view, from the docent to the collector to the namer to the person cleaning the room and so on. That work had not been done by anybody, and to my mind hasn't been bettered since that show, which travelled and where you would hear Rosalind Krauss in 1 second and the person who was a docent in the second, and you had to make a decision, which was the intellectual. Likewise with the question of stadiums or biennales or the university or expansion, all these themes. So it's a kind of one-man university carrying out these very amazing projects and also sharing that research more widely than academics are used to do. So incredible generosity and so on. So I was always completely jealous of MIT that Muntadas was here. So in a way I'm kind of relieved now of that. Why MIT let that happen, is an issue. But this room itself might be an explanation, because I can see Muntadas everywhere, and he is everywhere. I just can't see him in this room. And maybe this room is the reason that you're leaving. I mean, it's really kinky. Look, it's clear that the audience has to be protected, so you are behind these barricades. So you're in a sort of tiny room with friends, but you're like hunkered down. I mean, that's just astonishing. Just looking out there, it's just totally bizarre. And then there is this sort of 19th century curtain to protect the speakers from your observation of their shoes, presumably. So there's a sort of, so the audience is amputated from the head down, and the speakers are amputated. Even this, you see, and it's all pushed up. It's all like, so. This is exactly the kind of space that Muntadas would analyze, right? And just, I mean, really, it's completely unacceptable and weird. I mean, really, it's just the more you think about it. So when I saw the room, I realized he had to get out. Yeah, and then I was looking at the graphics of and I didn't, I couldn't really. I thought it was really interesting, the sort of amputation of the A and the T. And I was saying to Andreas, that it's really been sort of amputated. It's kind of very courageous, and he noticed something, that the T actually technology survives, right? T is still a T when you amputate it, but art is really under some sort of challenge, and then. But I think I figured it out. Is that because I also had the same feeling when Uta was here, and also don't know. I mean, universities in a way have sort of stockpile stupidity, really. And so I have now the theory, of course, that it was an A, and then when Uta left, they chopped a bit off. Muntadas leaves, they chop another bit off. So basically, art is on the way out. Or at some point it will become like a Horizon, sort of last artist standing sort of thing. And technology will, of course, it's MIT, but just keep trucking on. And C, the big C, you see, is sort of unaffected by that. And it's kind of, for me, a very frightening word culture. And of course, coming from New Zealand, where there is none, culture, or at least I was trained since a child to understand that culture was in the north. That culture was precisely what we didn't have. And so basically all of my own complications derive from this sense of being not in the place of culture. So if this is now the place of culture, you do have to get a better room. Really. But the theme of the panel, now to get less serious, because I hope you realize I was very serious in what I was saying. The theme is speculations on the future of urban space utopia. And of course I was struck by that word speculations. Because if this was a real estate conference, it would be the same title, Speculations on the Future of Urban Space. But then it would be reality, right? So maybe we could figure out the kind of relationship between the utopia and reality, and as has already been said, utopia is, as it were, not possible. So I'm just going to run a series of propositions very fast. The first would be, it's really tempting to say that public space is utopia, right? That it is a sort of mythological, unrealizable illusion. And it's actually a very good definition of public space. I think both the word public and the word space are not of much use, and may have never been of much use. But utopia might be a better word for what it is when people refer to public space. Anyway, I think public space, whatever that means, is produced by actions rather than being a space that's acted in. So public space wouldn't be a place where the public act, but would be a space produced by a series of actions that might be retroactively labeled and somewhat riskily labeled public. So that's like point number 2. Point number 3 would be, these actions are by definition speculative. In other words, the production of actions that would lead to the sense that there was something like a space that could be retroactively described as a public space, those actions would themselves have been speculative. Point number 4 would be, I'm putting numbers on, it's MIT. Number 4, sorry, 4.0. 4.0. I hesitate for a moment, right? Because is there an action that's not a speculation? Like, what's a not speculative action? Because in the infinite motions of everyday life and biology and physics and information and so on, how do you define or recognize action? Like, since everything, as you know, is on the move all the time, what would be action then? For example, breathing is not normally considered to be an action, right? But it's a good idea, right? So it could be that when you call something an action, it's already a kind of exceeding of the predicted motions. It's already, as it were, in that sense, speculative. Action might be tied, maybe this is 5.0, tied to a kind of reflection into the uncertainty of the present. So you kind of move. You actually sort of jump. So action might be always a kind of jump. And action would be actually a thing that couldn't be predicted from what you already knew. It's like in a sort of sea of movement, something happens that would not have been predicted by an analysis of the movements itself, and that would be an action. And that might even lead you to speculate that there is an actor, that required something, a kind of input of some kind to sort of trigger this. And I would insist that this action, this kind of speculative, this action that is speculation by virtue of leaving behind the enormous complexity of everyday rhythms, none of which are considered to be actions. Like, is the sunlight on your face an action? You probably wouldn't think so. But if one, you would not think it was a very good idea to sort of put yourself on the sun. In other words, what it was that produced this slightly warm feeling is bigger and more massive and more dynamic than you could imagine. So we are actually absorbed. So speculation is not about size or, but a kind of like a jump. And the present is always the thing that is most radically unknown. So any kind of move to the future, any kind of thought of the future is already by definition speculation in that sense. Speculation would be, I suppose, something that is not based on something that, as it were, leaves something behind. In a strange sense, if I jump, a real jump is not from A to B. A real jump is you kind of no longer in A, and you have the thought of B, and you're kind of wondering what's going on. It wouldn't be a jump. Walking is not thought to be a jump, right? So it's a kind of gap between where you find yourself, where you've been, and where you're going. It's a suspension. So speculation is a leap in that sense, and therefore it's a kind of, and this is not very MIT, you can't calculate it, right? So it's a kind of what's going on. And the what's going on occurs in the present being the weirdest thing of all. I could reframe it and say that, of course, if we're speaking about the future of urban space, physical acts would be speculations in this sense. In other words, speculation is not like, I wonder if we could all have a good time. It could be the way I move in the city, or what I do to the city, or what I build in the city. To the extent that those movements couldn't have been calculated before, they would constitute speculation. So speculation would be, in that sense, physical. On the other hand, the space of action is not necessarily physical. So now there's just the two sides of that argument. I think we're up to 6.0, right? That you can speculate, as it were, physically, but the physical space is not necessarily where action occurs, even though we tend to think of action in that sense. And by the way, in terms of the question of the future of the city, we know much more about what it would mean to live on Mars than what it will mean to live on Earth in 2050. Mars, almost all of us pretty much know what's sort of needed to survive there. We even kind of know the shapes. We make movies about it. We're training ourselves. We're endlessly training ourselves to understand what it would like to live on Mars. We have no training films, really, on what it will mean for that many billion people to be living together in cities in our grandchildren's time, right? So that's weird. So you could only ever speculate about that, right? That's a space of speculation. Point number 7 would be to get rid of the idea that you sort of know the solid world, it's sort of there, sitting there, and the invisible world is sort of unknown, mysterious, and complex. It's probably more like the other way around, right? And so what do we have, 2 minutes? You choose. What do you think? No, I'll give you a chance. What do you think? We can negotiate. What? 5 minutes. Okay. So very fast. So again, I'm just trying to get over my sort of bewilderment. For example, the architect must have sort of said something like, it'll be a sort of a fan. To which nobody said, why? Right? So this is an extraordinarily strange room, and inside the room are people that are probably expert at making, producing, describing, and analysing rooms, and I would defy you to come up with a reasonable understanding of what this room is, but also what it is for you to be in it. I just don't think you're going to get very far. At the same time, it's not just you in this room, right? It's your cell phones, and it's all the signals coming from satellites, from TV towers, radio stations, from little cell phone towers, from the routers that are buzzing around, from the Bluetooth, the remote controls, to the phone itself, to the little clickers, to the RFID tags that are drifting around in this room. So there's a gazillion radio signals in this room, and you're much more in the space of those signals than you are in this room, and you're quite expert about that. You know how to move around in that electronic space, but you don't know really what's going on with this physical space. But the architecture that really counts, and if we're going to speak about politics and political action, space of the public and so on, will be much more that space of radio than the space of this room. But we're inclined not to talk about that, especially in architecture, because radio is just so damn insulting that the defining characteristic of radio is that it doesn't care about objects, just heads on through. And we just refuse to talk to anything that doesn't at least slow down and pay respect to architecture, right? So we just imagine that we're in this room, this sort of room, this solid room, and we leave all that other stuff as if it's not really happening. But every object, including ourselves, seems to have a radio attached to it. Our environment is busy transmitting and receiving. There are galaxies of receivers, sensors, detectors, and scanners that continually decode the flows and contribute to it. It's really no longer clear what it is to be in a room, even if it was a good room, which it's not. Although I'm saying this so often now that you must be wondering, like, what's the hang-up here? Like, it's just a university. You're not telling me that the rooms in Columbia are interesting. No. But it is something to think about when expertise about buildings occupy buildings, you know, like this. We don't know what it's like to be in a room, a building, a city, or the countryside. We don't really want to talk about radio. We know and manipulate and move in the space of radio with unbelievable precision, in a sense that, in a way that we do not with the world of physical form. Radio ignores us by ignoring the object, and yet the objects around us are located, marked, connected, exposed, infiltrated, monitored, reorganized, promoted, locked, archived, protected, dissolved, and even destroyed in the space of radio transmission, objects and radio have become inseparable. Radio took the extreme effect, the already extreme effect of the telephone to a whole new level. Any two objects, places or people, could be instantaneously connected but now with telephone, but now more radically, any combination of people, places and objects can be linked not through lines of communication but amorphous and overlapping fields of connectivity. So we clearly live in an age of radio but don't know or might not know what that means. Architecture might even be a form of resistance to radio, a sort of systematic disavowal of that. So if one wants to ask a question like, what is the politics of public space today, and you ask it of a discourse like architecture that is afraid of radio, it's not really going to be able to deliver you some kind of answer. And just to remind you that increasingly the first thing that people do on waking up is to stroke their telephone with a kind of affection normally reserved for a newborn child. Maybe more affection. And anyway, it was the phone that woke you up. It was your alarm clock. And you are near it, not more than an arm's reach away. And therefore, consciousness is now, to finish, consciousness is the same as connectivity to your cell phone, which of course is a machine for bringing multiple radios to you and you to them. And the last thing you do before sleeping is also to check your messages, meaning, of course, that's not just the conscious world that's in a one-to-one relationship with radio, but the unconscious. You're presumably working through the stuff in your sleep. So when we speak of sort of human subjects, as it were, moving in space, it's no longer a question of saying moving in a space, a physical space, or in the space of radio, since subjectivity and radio have become so profoundly blurred, in a kind of realization of what was thought of as a utopia in its formulation in the 1960s with media theory, but of course going all the way back through the 19th century, there was this the sort of, as it were, imagination of electronic consciousness. Well, that consciousness was as it were, fully realized quite some time ago. But from a disciplinary point of view, we have not even begun to sort of take seriously the effects. So starting with the point number 0.0, that the idea of public space, there could not be anything more utopian than that, and utopia might even be a word for that. On the one side, let's say the sort of dream, the idea of public space as a dream, has to be reconciled with the brutal reality of electronic consciousness by which you are occupying a kind of shared world. And the word city is probably just a word for that which allows us to live together. So when we ask the question, what the hell is the city of the future going to be? What is whatever the name of the panel is, future of urban space, as distinct from unurban space, kind of weird, or urban without space, right? So it's actually an entirely meaningless sentence, but we sort of know what we mean, the future of urban space. How will we be living together is the question, in a moment in time in which we are so totally living together that it's, it's not hygienic at all. So it's almost the question would be, how will we not live together? How will we separate? How will we disconnect? And what would be the politics of that? What would be radical disconnection? And if we get into politics, which we should, there could be some arguments for this kind of individual dictatorship model. And Andres and I were just joking about the fact of, everybody says that they want democracy and all that. I don't believe that for 1 second. I have yet to meet anyone who likes the thought that a group of people could agree on something that would change their life. So at some sort of profound level, you can't even use that word democracy when speaking about this electronic space, because it's very unclear who or how many people are believing that idea, this word. I got to get away from the microphone. But I just think it would be, we should, this is really Andres' thought about, do people really believe in democracy? And it seems to me that would be a necessary question to ask before getting into any of the questions, because the word democracy might be beyond utopian. But utopia without actually anybody seriously wanting it to come true, because radical democracy is deeply threatening, right? Anyway, it's enough.
I should probably follow Mark and take my jacket off. Thank you, Mark. That's well. You just filled this room. You transformed this room with your thought. So thank you for that. I was just about to suggest you to leave this room, and relocate to the river. But we can do this later on tonight. But yes. My talk will address river cultures and hypothetical water age. And I will do that in 5 acts. So first is the water age. We saw some images of Venice today, and Venice is, of course, threatened by the rising sea levels. And also Netherlands and many places around the globe are under effect of the climate change and the rising sea levels. And of course, there is a question whether we should protect our cities and invest in this enormous effort into the so-called extreme engineering projects, or we should adapt our bodies and become amphibians. And to me, this second thought, I think it's more promising. And of course, I would like to speak where this promise is coming from. And that is a project, river project, that was conceived here at MIT. Initiated by György Kepes, who saw river as a public space. Let me quote from György Kepes' report on the work in progress at the Center for Advanced Visual Studies from 1972. Besides the sky, the river is the only aspect of our urban environment that has not yet been parceled out into real estate or butchered by human insensitivity or carelessness. It suggests faraway places and distant memories, and thus gives most needed sense of freedom. This is probably about the time when Kepes was meditating on the Charles and on the river that is just outside of this room. And of course, him and other fellows at CAVS were shocked by the inhumane scale of the urban development occurring in Boston at the time. And of course, they were thinking how to bring a certain sense of citizenship, as they saw the river being a place, ultimately public place, where the performance of the body and also certain cultures can be exercised, certain public cultures. So river is being seen not only as a public space, but also as, in a way, as a place that supports certain publicness. You know, and we can speak about certain cultures of rowing and swimming that historically belong to a certain class. So of course, transforming that situation, and especially in that specific environment, you know, which is the river, was crucial for this project that actually remained as hypothetical visions, as projections. They stayed as statements, drawings, diagrams, scenarios that were never realized, or their realization, let's say, was limited to some exhibitions, and of course, what these drawings, what these diagrams suggest, they suggest certain certain enjoyment of the environment, certain connection that within the discussion about cybernetics and feedback loops were imagined as certain connection to the environment, and seeing body as the center of the certain kind of like homeopathic kind of like mechanism, right? So the body is responding, you know, to the environment, and these are the drawings of Kepesh and proposals how to reimagine the river, how to reimagine embankments and that connect Cambridge and Boston with Charles River. And of course, Krzysztof was referring in his talk about the spectacle, about the festival. So and among those proposals, there are also those that that kind of like suggest certain place in the river, right? Place, you know, we can think about the island, or we can think about certain place where we can inhabit. But certainly those different devices, again, like, you know, borrowing from André Jaque, you know, architectural devices, right? They create certain condition, you know, or maybe infrastructure, right? We can call it infrastructure for the body performance in the public space. And in the context of that research, you know, we have certain, you know, we have voices of those who inhabit that river. River is neglected to default. And, you know, we have certain abruption, you know, we have certain amputation of the sentence here. And in this research for us was also interesting to connect with MIT Museum and to see what are other devices that imagine inhabitation of the environment. And with a group of students and researchers, we started this. You know, we started to look. You know, after looking at the archive, we started to look at the different cultures of the river. And of course, to understand those cultures, you need to be in the river. You need to swim. So, river is inhabited by different cultures. You know, I'm calling it cultures. And in order to meet, you either need to swim or cycle along the river. You need to discuss and understand and talk and engage. So this is a person who decided not to contribute to the exploitative system of rent and live in the river in this on this small boat. So there is a community in Oxford living on the canals, on these canal boats, and trying to also have part of the land on the boat, as you can see, and survive with the minimum of resources. You know, as you know, this boat has all what this person needs, you know, to survive, you know, including the water, electricity, and so we can consider that this is autonomous. But of course, boats need to moor and needs to be connected to the land. But living on the canal allows you constant migration from the point to the point, you know. So so the boat becomes this kind of like ultimate destination. Or people who create, like this person, who create a personal history of the river. So it's a river historian, self-made river historian, who writes the history of ISIS, as it is called, upstream. in Oxford and Abington. So, or this person who is Venetian rower in Oxford. So he suggests certain different cultural experience, so you can experience Venice in Oxford by being in a boat and experiencing certain atmosphere. So the boat, as probably this room and this symposium creates certain atmosphere. Or this person who is running almost kind of like obsolete becoming technology that is the lock keeper, right? So the locks used to be very important, in the culture, and not only culture of technology, but also the culture. And the lock keeper is this person who carries actually stories from one boat to another boat, as they receive boat, and then they let this boat to pass, and then they tell stories to another person. So because people on the boat, they want to hear what is happening, as the speed of the river is another very important component. You cannot go more than 5 kilometers per hour. Or this person who is art student at Royal Art Academy and decided to travel on the boat during the vacation period, and to make her practice and use materials all that she could kind of salvage on the trip. Or this person who is looking into the alternative means of transportation using their own bodies. So it's a little bit probably ties with the idea of reclaiming the streets. But in this case, we have new movement probably emerging, like reclaiming the rivers. Or this person who brings to the European kind of context, the Chinese tradition of yulowing, which is suggested as scientific rowing, as in contrary to the academic rowing, what we see on our rivers as demonstration of certain historical demonstration of certain class. It suggests much more engaging and much more probably also ergonomic kind of technique that is really based on the very ancient knowledge of the fluid dynamics. And of course, looking at these different cultures, we thought that it is important to create a device, that would help us to engage river cultures. Right? So I mentioned swimming and experiencing. And through the series of workshops with children and with other ages groups, we try to come up with certain designs for the structure that was actually inspired by certain kind of like spontaneity, right? Spontaneity in a sense that you could construct a structure from the things that basically are at your house, from the things that you can find in the emergency situation or in the urgency situation. So that's a skin that is produced in neoprene that was that allows actually to host the body, which is in the water. These are the buckets from the Chinese tea that was imported to England, and the water pipes from the water supply system. So the person in this lily pad is Giacomo, our student, and this is me, and you can see some tests. This is the first test in the river.
It's like it's swallowing me. It's really nice. It's like being in a hammock.
Like a squid.
Do you ever have those dreams where you're being swallowed by like a hole in the ground? This is awesome. Thank you.
Gediminas, reduce speed.
What?
We're getting it.
Now this corner.
Thank you. So, for me, this membrane, you know, I thought of this as kind of like individual, you know, kind of like membrane or the skin for your body that allows you to stay dry, as neoprene, you know, does allow you to stay dry, but at the same time experience water, you know. There are people who are hydrophiliacs, you know, who, when they see water, they want just to jump immediately. There are hydrophobics. In the symposium that we organize, that is called Vet Symposium, we had speakers, you know, addressing many issues, among those also biomimicry. And actually, a professor of biomimicry in Oxford University was hydrophobic, so he couldn't jump into the water, you know. So we were kind of like that gave us some kind of inspiration, you know, for the skin that allows you to experience the weight, you know. Because actually, when you are without the skin, you know, if you are in the water, you know, you would never experience the weight. Of course, you can experience pressure if you die, you know, but in a way, the skin allows you to wear the water as well. So, you know, it is variable device. And for me, what's really interesting that it suggests a certain collectivity, but not only with other humans, but at the same time, you could feel the body of the water, you know. So you kind of like, you could experience water as being, you know, another type of species. Thank you.
So, why don't you, I guess, come to the table, because I think Alexander will be coming in a second. He went to the loo. So please. Go ahead. Go ahead. So I want to start by saying how sad I am to be here, which is, I'm glad to see all of you and I'm glad to be out of my bubble, but I'm really sad about what this event represents to MIT and those of us who might have short or long futures at it, because I did not get enough of Muntadas in my time here, and I want more. So let's just put that on the table and figure out how to do it. And then I wanted to say something about really the way in which Caroline Jones kind of produced that super performance as a moderator who kind of just wung it, I guess. I'm not sure I can do exactly that. But I have 3 topics that may seem super reductive when I'm all done. But they were, for me, ways in which I thought I could make sense of the bodies of work that I knew stood behind these people. And so the words or the terms that I want to bring up for us are, on one end, imagination and maybe limits of it. Disobedience, and this comes both out of some of the work that we saw specifically here, but also the work that I know and the kind of actions that I know and associate with the characters in the panel. And then finally, archive as a very particular sort of actor, again, in the body of work, but also in Muntadas' work in an important way. So in a way, what I'll give you is a little bit more than these titles in 3 paragraphs. And the first one really comes out of the question of maybe utopia, because I've been looking at this title also for a while. And really, perhaps in a sense, a question of how we imagine hopefulness or how we think of hopeful futures from different frames of reference. And this is also in part in response to the fact that we have the panel that we have. Having discussed recently with Eda Čufer the extent to which the Slovenian group Irvin and also the rest of us or some of us who grew up under socialism saw the fight at the time, in the 80s and 90s, or how we dreamt of something better. We discussed this and we decided that really in a way we could not have we were not able to conceive of where we would go from where we were. That the only way we could think of something better at the time, and for Irvin this was a real fight. For me, I was a little bit younger and I was sort of dreaming. The only way we could conceive of something better was out of the material that we had experienced. And so it was a better, more just version of really socialism, though we didn't know that at the time. And so rather than the kind of transitions to capitalism that the new Europe has experienced in the last decade and a half or 2. And so I find it fascinating that really in this panel we have panelists operating from or with different baggage and all operating now in the context of global capitalism through forms of disobedience. So for me this highlights both the question of disobedience, but also in wondering how to make sense out of this, apart from the fact that maybe this is a symptom that we are all in some kind of more continuous context, which seemed too simple to me and too much like a truth that we are sort of repeating and have gotten used to without questioning it that much recently. I think it's still worth thinking about what we assume when we are agreeing on or what we're agreeing on when we say public space or utopia or even urban space. And some of that already came up in the presentations. And how are we agreeing on any of these terms when we're coming from post-Franco Spain, Soviet and post-Soviet Lithuania, New Zealand, Belgium, Serbia before and after Yugoslavia. So for me, this is something that I don't have an answer for, but I actually think would be an interesting topic to discuss, the kind of baggage that defines how we imagine and know whether or not we are agreeing. Disobedience, on the other hand, is something tactical. It makes conflict and even a kind of antagonism, protest of sort visible, but it does that without explicitly proposing systemic alternatives. And so we get to Ute's question of alternative, perhaps. And still, perhaps, out of it, eventually, one could synthesize or simulate positions that we could think of as alternative in some sense. But this is not the most important point of public space or critical artistic offering in the view of someone like Chantal Mouffe, and I'm going to channel her for another paragraph and a half, who in her recent discussion about the very intersection of the artistic practice and public space describes the space of possible arts practice that may have the capacity to challenge neoliberalism, and in her case, liberalism in general, through forms of frustrating it or through agonism. She proposes that the public space, which is multiple, discursive, political, and aesthetic, so city and no city, wired and everything else, right? Places where we somehow make an appearance as a public, could be the space that helps clarify the extent to which rational consensus or even discursive consensus is actually impossible. That this is its potentially critical function in a democracy. So Mouffe does not discuss architecture, but the abstract construct is somewhat transferable to architecture, short of the question of patronage. But perhaps sort of working perhaps through disobedience to highlight and instigate dissensus, to operate against expectations and against all the niceties of consensus, not because consensus is not really needed, but because it is in part constitutive of the logic of neoliberalism. And so in this equation, disobedience might be a tool by which we produce that kind of agonistic space. And so, and one of the sort of sub-tools of it will become, or is, archive, at least in some of the work that we've seen. So whether historical, ordinary, alternative, or political archive comes in here as a particularly relevant agent. And we encounter it in Muntadas' work, as well as Andris's, as well as Gediminas's, maybe Alexander's too in some sense, and I'd say Marx, though not obvious maybe today. So as that space already full, so that archive comes in as that space already full of antagonism and agonism and irresolution, and basically I think that the future of urban space or public space requires its agonistic histories to disobediently question its tendencies, momentary and current. So for me, those are the topics, sort of how we imagine and how we agree, how we imagine that we are agreeing. What's the role of disobedience, and what is the role of kind of histories of it, I guess, for all of us. That's my response. I guess I can see that.
Thanks, Anna. And so at this point, we will be able to hopefully begin a conversation between the three eminent positions and Anna's interrogation of those. At some point, it's important that people in the audience will be able to participate, so we'll start that pretty soon. But I mean, I'm humbled by the various interventions and proposals that we saw today. And I have just several, I mean, I have dozens of questions, but wrote down four, and would start with one. And this has to do with the technology issue that you brought up, Mark. You called it radios, lots of radios. I like the fact that you just used that word. Yeah. And this is the one thing, I mean, forget about the space, but this is the one thing that really impregnates all forms of discourse at MIT, and it's ultimately the relation to some kind of technology or technological progress, or progress defined through technology exclusively. And it's infectious and sometimes really problematic. But, you know, we try to also create space where that can be neutralized. But so to this point, is it true that, and this is a question for all of you, but maybe if you would start perhaps, in what way does this, the ubiquitousness of radios and endless communication, almost complete, I would say, transparency, at least visibility of all to all, this condition in which we find ourselves, does this become, I mean, how should we see this in enabling future action for artists, for designers, for people that are engaged with the topic of the public and its well-being? One possibility could be that we could see it as an accelerator of the enactment of disagreements. I mean, and one argument for it would be Occupy. And I know Occupy has been in the conversation several times today, but the fact that people can gather fast and mobilize resources fast to take over a part of the city, I mean, this technology helps for that. So, I mean, is it in fact an accelerator for staging disagreements or staging agonism and forms of antagonism? Or is it in fact simply a complete dissipator of that energy? I mean, the reason why Occupy ultimately didn't stay in the areas or in the spaces that it took, or that it to some degree was not able to go to the next level, we can find many reasons, but maybe one of them is that people got bored and were able to escape on screens and find a way to not have to be focused on the topic anymore. In other words, I mean, the ubiquitousness of our connectivity allows for a continuous escape from any problem we face in our lives. It's a form of opium for our masses today, perhaps, and in that sense, a dissipator of any kind of revolutionary energy. So, we talk about the city for the next 30 years. Do we have an acceleration of actively lived and contested democracy in space, or do we all just dissipate because we actually don't have the energy and the need, and if things get really troublesome, we'll just withdraw, which we can now, always. So question first for you and then for all of you.
Well, I don't have an answer, but could try to change the question a bit. Firstly, I wouldn't see radio as being more technological than buildings, for example, or human flesh. So I subscribe to the view that there's nothing more human. The only thing that's human about humans is technology. So it's like what we do and they don't. You know, like, so we have this technology thing. So therefore, again, in a kind of McLuhan sense, so technology is not other, like a kind of scientific sort of domain. It's a fully fleshy, emotional kind of projection of the kind of weirdness that we are, sort of thing. So that would be the first thought. And the second thought related to that is that it is ubiquitous, yes, but ubiquitous implies that there is a world which is then filled, so then it's ubiquitous. And I think that the sort of spaces of radio are, it's not one space filled with radio, but it's a sort of nesting and multiplication, a kind of kind of ecology of spaces. So it's ubiquitous relative to an older understanding of the city, let's say. And then that description of the space of radio as a sort of sort of multiple starts to address this political question, because it's also spaces of privacy and of censorship and of surveillance and of violence and of creativity, and it's like it's all there. It has unconscious. It's not conscious of itself. It's not, I don't know why this example is coming to my mind, but I don't think the American military would have been able to take down the Twin Towers. Just don't think they would have been able to do it. They would have had some missile that would have played chess and tried to, it just wouldn't have. So at some level, I don't subscribe to the view that the so-called technological world is a sort of world of known conspiracies and so on. I think it is full of all the weirdness of everything else. But at the very least, it could fit very well the Chantal Mouffe sort of model of a space of radical conflict and endless debate and so on. But the last point is that in the end, the so-called physical city is itself radio and is itself part of the very same system. It's just a bandwidth issue. It's just that the visible city is a very small part of the world of radio, and it's a very small part of the illusion of radio. And I think I read that in for example, in Andres's work, that when he says it's not the square, but finally you end up with a kind of a network image, and it's not a hierarchical network, it's a kind of amorphous in which building spaces, people, information, signs, symbols, colors are all interacting in a highly political way. And that's why, I mean, maybe I didn't make it clear, but it was Andres who turned to me just before he got up to speak and said, "Do you think people really believe in democracy?" And my immediate answer was, well, I don't, and therefore nobody does. I mean, so I think so. Then what in the Chantal Mouffe sense, included in the agonisms is a belief, beliefs in agonism versus beliefs in so-called democracy, complete disagreements about what constitutes democracy. So even the label that she was using from her early writings on radical democracy is almost implies a singular thing, that radical democracy idea. Radio could be such a space. So it could be a space, it could be, and should be, a space of sort of bloody conflict. It is anyway the space in which you do live and die. You know, the last thing you will hear, by the way, all of us, is sort of beep, beep, beep. And what I don't know is if, for example, do you hear the last bit? I mean, I haven't done it, right? And nobody's ever been able to tell us. But do you go like, beep, beep, beep? Oh shit! And then you go down. Like, do you actually hear the end of the radio signal? So I don't know. I really love the work of Andres because I think he's really pushing this button, really, really strong. So you should try to answer the question because I can't.
Well, actually, for me, this word radio is super good. And, well, I remember, for instance, the way you also described the other day, recently in a talk, the way it relates to pipes. That's another issue that could be amazing. But in a way, to go to the question, I think there's two ways of putting this question that, in a way, need to be think carefully. Like this idea that I took notes to say it properly, like we can escape to the radio, or we can escape to the online world, or to these other spaces. And the second one, that what we do could be accelerated by being also happening there. I think this is kind of limiting the way we can think of this. I think we live in a world that is composed by different materialities that somehow are connected and disconnected in many aspects, and that part of them are online, part are offline. This is the environment we live in. And let's say that in this environment, we are kind of trying to struggle politically. Because by being part of that, we are connected to many discussions and many domains and many administrations of power that not necessarily represent some of the networks we are performing in or being in. And I think that politics here are super important. Where I try to show is that L'Oreal knows this quite well, or performs this quite well, is occupying all those spaces in very different scales, from our hair to the continents, but also let's say it exists by being in all these technologies. The technologies of bodies, the technologies of advertisement, the technologies of money and markets. What I find is that we are kind of disputing in these arenas. And let's say that to exactly know in detail how politics are happening in those kind of common beings that are huge and that are very diverse and composed by all these connections and radiations, I think is what we are trying to do. And in my opinion, and it goes to the topic of democracy, democracy is based on some principles that somehow are not, or the way we tend to perform democracy now, it's based on a description of how we are being that is not so much, let's say, reviewed. And actually, the idea that, for instance, we are doing this and then we can accelerate by that is actually part of this limitation of the way we think democracy, because it's not that we can develop something there that will affect to the real politics that is the one that we are having offline. But we have to think of how all these composites or kind of assemblies can really be effective politically. And that's kind of the topic. For me, also, what is the role architecture can play in all that to be relevant on those politics? Yeah.
Thank you. Gediminas, would you like to say something to the...
No, I think it's fine.
Anna, do you have so let me just recap. I mean, I think this clarified things for me, but the question is, we are in a condition with the complete radioedness of ourselves and realms to which we are connected all the time that in fact changes. I mean, the discussion about the lack of public space seems to have to be completely reconfigured in this condition. And so the question is, in what way do you define a sort of a relevance in the network realm for alternative actions of taking public space or creating public space through an intervention? And is it even still possible? I mean, is the energy still there for that? Oh yeah, sorry.
Is this a question to me?
Well, to both of you.
Well, for me, I mean,
I don't refuse to speak about that.
You're going to speak? Okay, good. Because, I mean, for me, I'll just say, the work of Andres and the Urbonas studio both, for me, these are examples of how you produce public space in some sense, right? Through research and actual action in both realms. So that's just a quick intro to you.
Well, to me, I was just kind of, reflecting on the radio, and the reason why I did not want to respond on the radio is that, I have, these connotations, from the country where I was raised, too much connected to this so-called radio spot that was installed in every house, and that transmitted, channel constantly, 24/7. Regardless whether you wanted to turn it off or not, and this was, some kind of like meta voice of the regimes of the governmentality, that would speak, to you constantly, during day and night.
Right.
So for me, radio has this, connotation with strong connotation with those regimes, with the big brother, with surveillance, in a way. So. And even though it was just speaker, tuned to one channel, still, you could have a very strong sense of someone, who's watching you. And of course, from that, perspective, again, like, referring to Anna's earlier question, there is a difficulty actually acting in public space, So when we come, to the point of the voice, that can be cast freely, in the public space. I think there is a certain need for certain architectural devices or performative techniques, or maybe a combination of both, that could enable that limb that was cut, through these regimes of the mentality.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I hope we don't try. For me, the space of radio is not a space of liberation. It's architecture. It's a series of divisions, and it's a topology. It's a complex environment that we would, I think, ignore at our peril. But one theory would be that architecture, let's say in the sense of buildings, primarily its primary function has been disconnection rather than connection. So it's not like you have a world of solid objects that are sort of limited, and now you have this capacity to connect, or just, you know, on a wider scale. It could be that architecture is what it is through its ability to disconnect. That it's a disconnection system. And you could go one step further, that it's a kind of disavowal mechanism, that we build buildings in the sites of our maximum insecurity. A tombstone would be an obvious example. You know, you can never understand the death of someone you love. There's no like 12 steps. You know, you can't. So you stick an object, depending on which religion, you stick an object in the very site of your maximum uncertainty, and you put a name on it to, as it were, mark, and the object is really an object. It tries to be an object. So it sort of sits there as if that would deal with this. And there would be a thought that everything you see in a city is the same, that it has been basically strengthened at the points of maximum doubt. So even so-called public space, from that perspective, would not be the space in which everybody can get together, but a space in which getting together is really managed and, you know, limited and it's just, you know, it's really confined. And it was exhilarating to see, really exhilarating to see that technology get reactivated during the Occupy time, synchronized with all sorts of electronic media as well. And of course, when I say it was exhilarating, I mean it was exhilarating to watch on my cell phone images of people getting together in what I believe to be a public square, but have no evidence of that. So from that perspective, architecture's sort of function is to sort of act as a kind of a television studio within which certain kinds of images can be staged, and it might have always been that way, right? So for me, I wouldn't say kind of radio on the one side and like real spaces of human, the real voice here. I don't know. This is a horrible example, but children use iPads before they use the toilet. That means input-output issues for them are electronic before they are physical. And you know that when they learn how to use the toilet, it'll be with an iPhone app that goes like, well done. So for them, nothing could be more natural than the voice that they would have with that. And architecture could be quite unnatural, quite undemocratic. You know what I mean? So I sort of feel like we at least have to sort of run that through our head. I still thought it was great, the whole, it really was, you know, for architects, like, oh, it's not all over. You know, some of our tricks in the old trick of the public square, it still works. But did it work? Like, what happened to the Spanish Revolution?
Yeah, actually...
I mean, presumably it could have worked in ways I don't know, right?
Actually, it never happened only in the square. It happened in all these different spaces.
Yeah.
What I saw is just a tiny thing. There's now a collectively produced map of all the political discussion that happened there, which is like this. And what I saw today, which is not being described in the map, is only like feminism. That's the only thing. With no the rest of the extensions that we could detect it by interviewing all these people. But this is kind of something like this in a map like this. So I could imagine that it happened in a huge amount of devices, connected and disconnected. And I think that that's really what is interesting for me, that the space in which, or let's say the entities in which architecture is produced are very different to the images we think that we have of what we think architecture is. And they are, for instance, multi-scalar. They are produced by the combination of heterogeneous entities, like have been described in the STS tradition. They are, for instance, performative. It's something that it's only happening, those connections or these connections as they happen, but then they disappear. They're multiple, they overlap, so the same microphone could be performing different enactments. And I think this is something that we're starting to discover. But in a way, it's also demanding to us new ways of speaking, new ways of thinking many of the principles of our practices, and it's also something exciting, I think.
I mean, I would imagine that the Spanish Revolution or the Egyptian Revolution, or which other one happened this last year? There's like a series of these events that have been happening over the last 5 or 10 years are no more or less successful than the ones that we've already seen in the past. So when Hannah Arendt looked at or described or discussed the 1956 events in Budapest, which was a failed revolution, if the failure or success of it is judged by whether it changed the system, she described it as successful in its flaring and flickering and constituting a kind of public. And so the key thing that is different is that there are other tools by which we also congregate and discuss and produce a kind of, or aggregate, I guess, might be a kind of Latourian word, but they are equal in some sense, that the public got constituted through their interests for a moment in time, and they will take that with them wherever they go next. Right. The sense of themselves as a public.
Right.
Well, I mean, I do want to bring us back for a second to the question of the urban futures and the speculative part here. I mean, none of us can predict what is going to happen, but there are some trends. And one of the trends is to, we already talked about. One of the trends is, and it was brought up several times, increased connectivity, connectedness, visibility of all to each other. And fine, I mean, I can agree easily with both of you that we don't need to highlight the distinction between physical space and all the radios and the networks. At the same time, someone did point out, and I think it's very important, if you look in this trend that you try to identify where the critical project is, it may be in disconnection, in lack of connectivity, in cutting the cords or the wireless connections. And so this is one thing that, I mean, if we, let's say just could be 3 trends that we can easily see occur. One is increased connectivity, to which the critical counter project would be cut connections, disconnect.
It's very dogmatic.
Well, I mean, I'm
going to channel Chantal Mouffe a little bit more.
Please.
I mean, you don't get to the point of irresolution or antagonism by producing the exact opposite of where you're going, because that's just simply proposing a solution that is not possible, because the resolution or solution is not possible in her book, and I am holding it right now, holding her up.
No,
Feeling it.
Yeah,
today.
I do think that sort of strategic disconnection, which sounds at first to be the opposite of occupy, but strategic disconnection could have as politically a destabilizing effect as occupation, like sort of not being there versus being there. And again, it's just because I assume that all my character flaws, if expanded, would improve the human race. For example, the obligation that people feel to respond to emails, which imprisons them socially, but not just to their work. I mean, just basically their entire lives get trapped in all of that. So,
but that's sounding like disobedience, not as disconnection.
Well, this is why
dogmatically,
but
right?
let's say if a huge slice of American society stop responding to emails, or even more radical, you never knew whether they. I mean, there was just a sort of indeterminacy about whether they would respond or not. Huge sections of the everyday operations of society, universities, and so on would be brought to their knees, literally. So I do think. So firstly, I think yes, disconnection can be a personal and collective act of great significance. But it seems to me that disconnection will occur in the dense, hyper-connected city. I mean, the old association of going to the countryside to disconnect. So two apparently opposite hypotheses, but I think are both true. The first would be cities maximize connectivity. That is the reason why cities are the best invention of the human species, because they accelerate. They are accelerators. If I walk 100 meters in the countryside, I will see 3 cows and my grandfather. If I walk 100 meters in a city, I will encounter maybe 1,000 people, each one of which is a possible exchange of information or genetic material, right? So the city maximizes connectivity. It is the reason why everybody pours into cities. But cities are also famously places where one can be truly alone. So, in fact, where else can you be alone but in these sort of spots? So I do think that then there's a kind of architecture which is no longer the architecture of the home, like the IKEA thing, but there can be a sort of another set of architectures that relate to the way you disconnect in the face of the possibility to connect. That's why even just the gesture not to respond to your email is already the drawing of a line that I would consider to be thoroughly architectural, and more so than buildings which are almost entirely dominated by hiding things. I mean, the idea of transparency in architecture is one of the best jokes we've ever had. The second best joke was high-tech architecture, which for us is big pieces of metal with nuts and bolts, and nobody laughs. Right? So basically, transparency in architecture and high-tech architecture, we really are able to throw these things out into the world and nobody laughs. Transparency in architecture is just ridiculous. Ridiculous. Architects are absolutely agents of. And that's why you're, again, I mean, I just use him. Every time I run out of things to say, I say, as Andreas would say. Right? But you wanted to, even the construction site shouldn't be seen. Especially the construction site. Anyway.
I think this is terrific. And if there was a critical project, I don't think it's dogmatic per se. I mean, isn't the whole, by the way, isn't the whole raison d'etre of art that is being articulated throughout this conference as being a resistance against the dominant system and producing that resistance? If connectivity is the dominant mode, then disconnection becomes by default part of the art of at least a segment of the artist world's project. And the strategic disconnection as a project, I think, is terrific. What you showed on the river, for me, is also a potential example of that, by being, brought into a pod where you're confronted with your own body, and at the same time networked with 4 or 5 other people, in fact, cut loose from the rest. I find, I read things maybe that you don't want to have read in there, but I see a potential element in that strategic disconnection project articulated there. If we go back again to the long-term urban futures, next 30 years. Oh, you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, first I want to respond to what Mark said. Yes, Gerd Loving wrote this little essay called "Principle of Not Working," where he described possibility of being in the network, but not necessarily, responding on the daily basis, like even lurking, and according to that principle, filtering information, and even deleting information is, it's also kind of like letting it kind of like cycle through your body, through your kind of like brain, through your kind of like perception, So without kind of like any sign of contributing to this apparatus or the mechanism of being enslaved to constant response. Right, so kind of like this constant production of labor of responding, but then again, responding to this kind of withdrawal, I don't see that device as kind of like as a withdrawal, because to my big surprise, actually, it produces new forms of collectivity. Like suddenly people passing by, they wanted to, as it was captured in this episode, that's people just wanted to jump in, and experience kind of like. And what was really interesting, especially during the VET Symposium, that it was not, because when we are thinking about, about certain architecture of that space, we thought that it is in kind of like, for the individual experience in a way. But suddenly, we had 2 or 3 people jumping, into this one. So and suddenly they were claiming certain kind of like, collective experience, right? Yeah. So that was really, interesting moment.
Very interesting. I don't know how much time we have left, but it's probably good to open it up to the audience at this point. How much time do you have?
We're almost out of time.
Okay. Sorry. All right. So, yeah, Ute, please.
Yeah, I have one question. In terms of following up on this, to disconnect, but don't you think it's more like that to follow up what Gediminas said, like not to be busy anymore? Is it not like we are constantly busy and we are kept busy? And was there not a time coming back to Utopia? Coffee houses or like flaneurs, like to appreciate or to have this void or like where ideas come. And don't you think like the big problem is like the systematic of the disappearance of the public spaces, also the disappearance of the void, like of the free time where you get maybe weird ideas or like you suddenly, become disobedient. So this notion of like keeping us constantly busy, I don't think it's connectivity, it's keeping us busy, because I don't think we're really connected, we're constantly busy. And I really wonder what happened to that. You said like this notion, there was a moment when it was projected that there is no more work. Like leisure time is the big thing, and now people work so much, and those who don't work, they feel guilty, and like they need work, and of course they need work to be part of the system because it's so expensive. So I think it's not connectivity, it's this not allowing anymore this free space, and the public space is kind of a representation of the free space, and this void is no more there. And I wonder, like, what do you say, like, how can we reproduce this void or the empty space?
Yeah.
Well, just a quick reaction. I'm in favor of disconnection. I don't know if that is a sign of my age. So the thought that that the disconnected time, the so-called free time, is when I would have ideas, and it could be that when I'm speaking to a younger person, they feel like they have all their ideas in the middle of the busyness. Now, of course, one doesn't know what one's age is doing, so I somewhat desperately would offer another rationalization, which is, busyness could only be experienced as busyness if it had an other. So you do the sort of strategic off cycle or whatever only just to sort of show yourself how busy you are. So the purpose of it is to really, so I could agree with a younger person that they're having all their ideas in the middle of all the chaos. Just for myself, I feel like it's unpredictable. The ideas come anywhere along that spectrum. So having a kind of ecology, a kind of biodiversity of rhythms and so on seems to be, for me, better than one. I love the point that Angela made earlier, that if somebody says I'm a rebel on the internet, that's just an affirmation of the system. It's not a rebellious act. I think this is very, very true. So a lot of what the younger person might say about the ideas that they have in the middle of the business might be understood as just sort of oil for the system. But I also know that they keep inventing and subverting those systems in very, very creative ways. And so I just don't know. If we are nostalgic for the cafe, they will say, there's never been more cafes, Yeah. Universities have become sort of extensions of Starbucks, right? So, I don't know.
Antonio.
Well, just a brief comment about what you define a little bit invisible architecture. in terms of the radio, etc. I think I was very surprising traveling in Europe. Then borders, they don't exist anymore. But exist in the moment when you pass, for example, from Belgium to Holland, and you start to hear beep, beep, beep. And it's because the provider is to say you are passing from T-Mobile to Verizon. Or if you pass from France to Belgium, I mean, it's in a way, this, just to illustrate it, what the disappearing the borders, I mean, imaginary disappearance of the border, but appear the borders of the corporations. And I think it's at the moment when you travel in Europe, I mean, versus other places where the borders are evident, becomes very strong. The other comment I want to make is about this room. And I think when we discussed it with Gediminas about doing the symposium, it was the Bartos room that is 400 or 500 people. We say, oh, let's go to be a place where we could be intimated discussion, you know, and I can. And I feel like, and we discussed that in other situations, we know the universities, they deal with two types of architecture. The architecture you have in Colombia, that is the monastic architecture, the monastery, and the transparency architecture of here. You know, and in a building so transparent, in order to be intimated, we decided to be in this room. Even with the possibilities, I think is the smaller auditorium in campus. Like that, that's one thing. The other thing is in the building of the Media Lab. And if you start to thinking about radio, radiations, and waves, we think we are in a, it will be interesting to analyze the amount of radio and radiation this building has.
I just want to, do we have time for one more question? Yeah, one?
I'm just feeling a little bit disoriented at the discussion of urban space that's not discussing the militarization of urban spaces, especially since in the United States and also Tahrir Square and many other places, the Occupy movement didn't dissipate because people were bored because of the ubiquity of the screens on their cell phones. They were violently destroyed by police actions. And we're coming up on the one-year anniversary of the shutdown of the city of Watertown, and we had tanks rolling down the street because things that used to have squad cars and police are now having to have urban spaces that can facilitate the rolling of tanks down those streets. And also to the point of ubiquity of one-to-one or many-to-many or all-to-all doesn't acknowledge the reality that it's not all of us who can set up a fake cell tower that will harvest all of the communications that are happening near demonstrations, which is all of the police departments around the country are now doing that. So the radio space has also been militarized and appropriated by police actions. And so to imagine a space and not acknowledge what's been going on with militarization and the police actions is confusing to me. I just wondered if someone would, how could we discuss that and not acknowledge that prevalent reality?
No, that's well taken.
But in defense, I did say that the world of radio was a space of censorship and occlusions and so on. I would only just the point about the physical architecture being already part of the disavowance on is to say that it was already militarized. So it's not like the arrival into a public space of a set of protesters, then countered by the arrival of authoritarian mechanisms, technologies, and so on to remove them. The space was only ever allowed to exist in that form because it was part of a sort of strategy in which you can't separate military from economy, from information. So in other words, it's really like the oldest of stories. No, my argument would be it doesn't ever accelerate. Architects as a discipline, when they were formed, were responsible for the military machinery and for the architecture. And of course, they were responsible for one against the other. So the field begins with a kind of understanding that the sort of solid city is itself a military organization. So for me, it's a kind of a given that maybe this is just too simple to say that and it's actually to agree with you, but like to say this is always the case. Shopping malls are permanently militarized in the sense that you describe. Yep. You don't need to see a protester being dragged away. What's more interesting are the kinds of people who don't get into the shopping malls in the first place because those systems are efficient enough to stop it from happening. Those legal regulations that actually limit the number of people who can congregate in a shopping mall, because that would already be constituting, in other words, I would agree with you totally, but just say it's not the tanks are not the best symptoms, it seems to me, of the real kind of horror of that situation. And then the final kicker, but this is said so flippantly, and our own complicity in it. Right? So if there was a vote taken in Boston in the moment that those tanks were rolling, if one believes in democracy, what would have democracy said about the tanks? Mm-hmm. And it's not so clear to me. It seems very likely there would have been a vote for the tanks. Mm-hmm. And so those are not then someone else's tanks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. The American suburb, bom, 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 bom. Right? It's an image of the absence of the military, but it is entirely a military operation launched on the argument of nuclear defense, an image of you showed it, of house on the prairie, so the final comment would be house on the prairie is, he had a gun, right?
Yeah. But
and he used it.
actually, I think this is an amazing question because, as you were saying, the extension of the militaries or the military networks are invisible in many aspects. As you said, like Little House in the Prairie is part of that, and in the case of L'Oreal, it's totally part of that. But we don't perceive it like that. But actually, many of the forces that you're talking of are really getting into ordinary life by kind of funny ways, and to really detect what are the protests that are happening also in those extensions and how are they technologically constructed. It's very interesting because then you see that also the resistance to them, the opposition, the alternative, is equally complex. So for me, it's also very important because to consider that things like Revlon is very important and that is connected to those other technologies that we tend to identify easily as something that has violence in it. But it's not so easy to see it in the hair dyeing products. And this connection is part also of the politics of nowadays. And many times we think that the most important things are just banal things. And when we trace the connections, then we see how important they are, and also how important it is to look carefully to the way it's being resisted.
But you are right that it's amazing we could speak so long without using the word military. Right? It's a problem. Yeah.
I've gotten a pretty strong signal that it's time to end this session. Thank you very much.